Hi, welcome to Bernard's Essay Talk and this third of 4 films looking at what I've called the 3 Johns, that is to say John Locke, John Stuart Mill and John Rawls. In the last film I looked at Locke, what he brought to the liberal table, what was radical in his thought, what was conservative in his thought, and how his thought fitted into the wider liberal philosophy. In this film I'll do the same with John Stuart Mill. And if Locke got the liberal ball rolling, inventing new forms of thinking and creating the template for liberalism, Mill didn't exactly create new thought, but he took existing thought and made it better. And that of course means that he took existing liberalism and made it better. Unlike Locke, Mill was not just a philosopher, but a political philosopher with political intention, trained by his father, who had great ambitions for his boy to be a reformer and a leader. So poor old Mill was required to learn Greek by the age of 3, Latin by the age of 9, was reading Plato by the age of 10, and learning logic and economics by the age of 13. And perhaps it's not surprising that he had a breakdown by the age of 20. Now, Mill brought 2 things to liberalism. And as I've said, these weren't so much new ideas, so much as a deeper appreciation of 2 existing liberal ideas, those of freedom and the individual, which in Mill's hands became liberty and individuality. And it's his reworking of these that he brings to the liberal table. But like Locke, there is a deep tension in Mill's thought between his radical and his conservative instincts, between the radical instinct to confront established power and the conservative instinct to support existing forms of hierarchy and vested interests. So on one side, Mill's a feminist, he's nearly a socialist and even a kind of early environmentalist. But on the other, he's an out-and-out elitist, telling us that some people can't have rights because they don't have sufficient reason. And I'm going to explore these ideas in 4 very small parts. The first is Mill's distinct contribution to liberalism, which of course is his reworking of freedom and the individual, becoming liberty and individuality. The second is his radical commitment to feminism, sympathy with socialism, and early environmentalism. The third part is his conservative elitism and his willingness to deny rights to others. And finally, the fourth part, looking at how his thought fits into the wider philosophy of liberalism. So beginning then with section 1 and Mill's contribution to liberalism. Now this is set out in his book On Liberty, which is the sacred text of freedom and the sacred text of liberalism as the philosophy of freedom. And if you read it, it feels like you could be reading something written today. And in terms of freedom, it goes way beyond Locke, for instance, who had a very basic idea of negative freedom. And what Mill is going to do is he's going to extend the definition of freedom. He's going to extend the idea of the threats to that freedom, and he's also going to extend the purpose that can be made of our freedom. And I'll take each of those in turn. In terms of extending the definition, for Mill, freedom is not just freedom from the abuse of power, but the freedom of both what he calls the inward and the outward domain. That is the inward private domain of our conscience and our thought, and the outward public domain of our pursuits and our interests. And in all of these, he argues for the maximum freedom, telling us the only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way. And there is something very radical, very modern, and very challenging in all of this. So for instance, these are exactly the kind of arguments that you can imagine a modern liberal bringing to arguments about sexuality and gay marriage, for instance. Or, in many ways on the other side of the fence, listen to this. If all mankind were of one opinion and only one person were of a contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. Now there's a lot in that sentence, but if you unpack it, it's exactly the kind of thing that a modern libertarian might use against those kinds of arguments about no platforming or safe spaces in the name of what critics might call political correctness. So Mill's thinking really does tap into the kind of debates and the kind of arguments that we have today. And in terms of the threats to liberalism, of course, Mill agrees with Locke that the state is the first and obvious enemy of freedom. And he formulates this in what he calls his harm principle, which is to say that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over an individual against their will is to prevent harm to others. But beyond this, he adds something new, telling us it is not just the state that threatens freedom, but what he calls the tyranny of the majority. Because in Mill's opinion, in a democracy, the majority can oppress a minority, either by law or by public opinion itself, or as he puts it, through physical force in the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion. And moving now to the extension of the purpose of freedom, again, Mill is going to go way beyond Locke's pretty minimal idea of commercial or religious freedom. Because for Mill, freedom is way more important. In fact, for him, it is the very basis of progress and development. The progress and development of the individual, of a culture, and of civilization itself. So that's the first big contribution from Mill to liberalism. The second one is the idea of the individual, or what Mill is going to call individuality. And the elevation of freedom as the noblest and most important idea in liberalism for Mill is made in the name of the individual as the noblest and most important cause for liberal politics. Because in Mill's view, we are progressive beings with immense potential. And the purpose of liberty is to develop that potential, which is to say, to develop our individuality, which for Mill is the goal of humanity, the source of our well-being, and the foundation of our culture. And what Mill is doing here is connecting the idea of individuality to a much stronger conception of progress. So it's not just a stronger conception of freedom and a stronger conception of the individual or individuality that Mill is bringing, but also a stronger conception of progress. And he's bringing these to the liberal table, which ultimately means he's bringing or developing a deeper and stronger form of liberalism. And in doing this, it's important to say that Mill's idea of individuality is not the same as individualism. Individualism tends to stop with the individual, conceiving each of us as separate and autonomous beings. But for Mill, an individuated person or someone who develops their individuality is not an isolated person, because true individuality is a person fully realised, and a person fully realised, he argued, has a sense of unity with mankind and a deep feeling for the general good. So he says, it would be a great misunderstanding of this doctrine to suppose that it is one of selfish indifference, which pretends that human beings have no business with each other's conduct in life, and that they should not concern themselves about the well-being of one another. Indeed, there is need of a great increase of disinterested effort to promote the good of others. So that then is Mill's distinct contribution to liberalism. Now let's go to section 2 and look at what was radical in Mill's thought. And what was radical in Mill's thought is nowhere better expressed than in his feminism. And it is perhaps his breakdown, his discovery of feeling, of emotion, of poetry, finding the love of his life in someone called Harriet Taylor, as well as his radical conception of individuality as involving sympathy to others. Perhaps it's all these things that made Mill a feminist. And Mill's feminism is very real and very radical. And it's set out in his book, The Subjection of Women, written in 1861. And as one author stated, in this text, Mill shows an acute understanding of women's subordination to male power and the way that it corrupts both men and women. So that in The Subjection of Women, Mill describes, for instance, the family as a place of male despotism and suggested, rather controversially, I think, that women's oppression is worse than slavery. So he says, no slave is a slave to the same lengths, and in so fullest a sense of the word as a wife is. And it was probably Mill's conception of individuality beyond narrow individualism and his notion of a fully developed individual as having a deep sense for mankind and the general good that made Mill, particularly in his later writing, increasingly critical of capitalism and landed wealth, and increasingly sympathetic to socialism, stating in 1848, for instance, that the state is at liberty to deal with landed property as the general interests of the community require. Now that sounds much more like Marx than Mill, and one of the things that's interesting about that is that this seems to contradict his harm principle, which talks about a negative liberty. We can only interfere with others if they do harm to others. This seems to suggest a kind of positive freedom, that we must intervene in politics to pursue the good of the community. And this shows how Mill, in many ways, is a kind of bridge between the old classical liberalism emphasising negative liberty and the new modern liberalism that will be much more sympathetic to positive liberty. And finally, Mill argued for what he called the stationary state, which is a state in which, having reached a certain level of development, would no longer look to unceasing economic growth. So we could stop what he called the trampling, crashing and elbowing of getting on. And such a state, he argued, would facilitate a smaller population, greater income, and would allow us to enjoy the beauty of nature and look more to improve the art of living. Okay, now turning to section 3 and Mill's conservatism. Because despite Mill's efforts on behalf of women, his sympathies with socialism and his early green consciousness, Mill was an absolute, complete and unreconstructed elitist, which of course is the criticism levelled at so many so-called liberal elites today, who, like Plato and along with Mill, believe in the rule of the educated and the superiority of cultivated intelligence. And in this way, Mill argued that representative government was ill-suited to what he called the barbarous and backward peoples, and that extra votes should be allocated to the university educated. And in what is at best a great irony and at worst a great hypocrisy, argued in no less a work than the sacred text of freedom on liberty that despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians. Okay, finally now moving to section 4 and Mill's place in liberalism, which, like Locke before him and Rawls after him, cannot be underestimated. And of course, there is the problem of his elitism, which is really, I think, a wider problem for liberalism. But if we look at how he contributed to its more progressive ideas, I think you can argue that he gave much greater depth to liberalism and greatly extended its core ideas. And if we return to the three core principles and themes that I set out in the first of these four films, we can see that his arguments for liberty and individuality, and indeed his stronger idea of progress, speak directly to liberal core principles. And I think more than any other thinker, he made liberalism a much more human philosophy, which at best, and of course this is not when it excludes those it sees as having insufficient reason, is deeply concerned with the feeling, sentiment and well-being of individuals, not conceived as atomized units, but as social beings of dignity and potential.